The church bells rang over Dustwater that morning, but the whispers cut sharper than the wind. Folks said she weren't fit to wear white, that her body was too wide, her beauty too thin. Every laugh was a knife, every sideways glance a bullet. The groom stood silent, jaw locked, while the town waited for his shame to show. But then, a soft voice rose above the cruelty. The merchant's daughter, eyes burning with truth, spoke words that stopped the whole street cold. And in that instant, the weight of mockery turned into something no one expected, something that would change the way Dustwater measured beauty and worth forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The bells of Dustwater tolled heavy that morning, ringing out like they had for countless Sundays. Yet today their sound carried no holiness, no promise, no joy, only a weight that pressed down on the dirt streets and the people who lined them, waiting like a jury for a verdict already whispered 100 times over. The bride stepped into view, her dress a pale white against the ochre dust, her veil trembling not from the wind but from the hands that held it. She walked slowly, each footfall heavy, as though the ground beneath her feet had grown hostile, stretching longer with every step, daring her to stumble before the eyes of those gathered. They did not cheer, they did not smile. Instead, they whispered, voices slicing through the bells with cruel precision, sharper than barbed wire strung along the edge of town. "Too wide for white," hissed one woman, hiding her smirk behind a lace glove. "Too plain to be called a bride," muttered a man, spitting tobacco into the dirt. The children, learning cruelty before kindness, snickered openly, their laughter rising like crows startled from a tree, cruel and mocking, striking her ears like the crack of a whip. Every laugh was a knife, every sideways glance a bullet she could not dodge, lodging deep in her chest, carving at her spirit until she thought the fabric on her back might unravel and expose her to the bone. She clutched her bouquet tighter, its wilted blossoms trembling with her grip, as though the fragile flowers alone kept her from collapsing beneath the weight of scorn. The church loomed ahead, but the distance between her and its doors stretched endlessly, a gauntlet line not with bullets or pistols but with sneers, each face daring her to falter. Her beauty, they said, was too thin, her body too much, her worth too little. Yet she walked on, her chin trembling but unbowed, her eyes fixed not on the ground nor the jeering mouths but on the church spire that pierced the blue above, a single promise of sanctuary she could not yet claim. In that walk, the air itself grew thick with tension, the desert wind circling her like a restless beast, stirring the dust into little storms that curled at her dress hem, as though the land itself bore witness to her trial. Every step was defiance, though the town called it foolishness. Every breath was courage, though they named it vanity. The bells kept tolling, heavy and relentless, as if counting down not to a wedding but to an execution. And still she moved forward, her dress no longer a symbol of purity but a banner of stubborn endurance, stitched not with lace but with the weight of a woman's will. Each whisper, each smirk, each cruel laugh was meant to cut her down before she reached those doors. But still she walked, slower than she had dreamed, weaker than she had hoped, yet moving, always moving, refusing to fall, while above her the sun climbed higher, spilling light over the crowd and the bride alike, as though to mark which of them stood in truth and which in shadow. Her steps faltered as if the earth itself conspired to slow her. Every yard of that dirt road yawned into a trial, each footfall a small victory against a distance that felt rigged to punish. And all the while Dustwater pressed in around her, a living fence of faces hungry for spectacle rather than joy, neighbors and strangers drawn by the cheap certainty of mockery. The crowd gathered like vultures, patient and precise women in their bests leaning together, gloved fingers to lips, weaving whispers that slid through the air like knives. Men under their hats offered low, knowing smirks and soft thuds of boots on wood, measuring, weighing, placing bets on her dignity. Children echoed the adults with brutal mimicry, snatches of cruel laughter that felt rehearsed by habit rather than born of the moment. Gossip braided itself into the morning like flyaway straw, each strand naming her seams, her appetite, the wrong shape of her shoulders, too wide for white. One hissed, "She shouldn't be parading." Another sniffed. Words like small stones pinged off her composure. The air tasted of dust and old grievances. Spittoons were tipped just enough to show contempt. A man cleared his throat to punctuate a joke. A woman pursed her mouth as if swallowing a recipe of scorn. The church spire, which had once been a promise, loomed now like an altar to judgment, its shadow offering little refuge because the congregation had become the jury. She felt them cataloging her body, face, laugh, reducing a life to measurements and rumor, and with every careful, shaking breath she fought the urge to flee, to drop the bouquet into the sand and run until the dust swallowed her footprints, and the town forgot the shape of her. But something older than that urge held her feet to the path. The memory of mornings she'd risen before the sun to mend a shirt, to feed a child, to keep a roof from leaking. The small, stern pride of hands that knew labor and mercy both. Her grip tightened around the wild bouquet until the knuckles blanched, not because the flowers mattered, but because that act of holding was an oath to herself she would not be pulled apart by voices. For a heartbeat the crowd's sound swelled, a tide of opinion that could drown a quieter spirit, then shifted an intake of breath like wind through a canyon when a child's laugh slid into a different key and an old man's jaw unclenched as if hearing something new. Those shifts were tiny as moth wings, but they mattered. Dignity is contagious, as is shame, and the balance between them trembled on the bride's slow forward motion. She stepped closer to the church doors, each movement a small defiance, and though the vultures had circled ready to feed on humiliation, her perseverance began to look less like spectacle and more like declaration. The crowd, which had expected a collapse, found instead a woman who, despite the sting of 100 petty judgments, carried herself with a stubbornness that would not be catalogued or sold. In the hush that gathered uneasy, suspicious, new, her faltering steps became a kind of answer. Not an apology, not a performance, but the simple, hard fact of moving onward. And in that motion the town saw, whether they liked it or not, that the real measure of a person is not the sum of other people's whispers but the weight they bear while still walking forward. The groom stood like a statue at the doors of the church, his boots planted in the dust that swirled lazily around him, his hands knotted into fists at his sides, and his jaw so tight it seemed carved from stone. Yet his silence was the loudest sound in all of Dustwater. Folks read it like scripture, each one interpreting it to fit the story they wanted to believe, some whispering that his pride had curdled into regret, others saying his shame was too heavy to hide, and all of them waiting for the moment when he might flinch, might step back from the threshold and leave the bride standing alone in the dirt. To the townsfolk, silence was weakness, a confession, the slow unraveling of a man too proud to speak but too cowardly to stay, and their eyes sharpened with the thrill of watching his struggle play out like a duel under the noon sunday. Men chewed their tobacco slower, leaning on fence posts with narrowed eyes, measuring the tension in his stillness like they would the draw of an opponent's pistol. Women fanned themselves but did not look away, hiding smirks behind lace while speculating in soft, venomous tones about how long a man like him could keep from cracking beneath the weight of ridicule. Even the children felt the shift in the air, quieting their laughter to stare at the man they had been taught to expect strength from, their young faces already etched with the cruelty of expectation. The groom's silence stretched, a taut rope strung across the church steps, threatening to snap with every passing second. Some said he should have spoken by now, offered a smile, a word of comfort, anything to shield his bride from the knives of gossip, but he did not move, and so the town mistook restraint for surrender. Inside him, though, war raged louder than any words could carry memories of hardship and sacrifice, of a woman's kindness when the world had been cruel, of promises made in quiet moments that no ridicule could erase. Yet he wrestled with his own pride, too. The pride of a man who knew he was watched, judged, measured like cattle at auction, and the pride of one who had sworn never to let others dictate his worth, but now stood under the sharpest scrutiny of his life. His silence was not empty. It was the storm before lightning, the coiled strength of a rattlesnake that waits before it strikes. And though the town did not yet understand, the stillness was its own kind of defiance, a refusal to play the part they had written for him. The air pressed heavy, as though the desert itself paused in expectation, the bells gone quiet now, replaced by the heartbeat of anticipation. The groom's eyes never left the path his bride walked, his jaw locked not from shame but from the discipline of holding back the flood of words that burned to be spoken. He watched her falter and yet keep moving, watched her bear the knives of their neighbors without collapsing, and his silence became not a mark of weakness but a private oath, one that would, when the time came, be spoken in a way that Dustwater could never forget. But for now, to the crowd eager for spectacle, he remained a riddle, a man standing at the threshold of love and judgment, waiting, enduring, and holding his silence like a weapon sharpened by patience. The bride's breath caught hard in her throat, sharp and shallow like a swallow fighting against thorns, her chest rising with the weight of a world that had never given her permission to dream beyond the narrow confines of what Dustwater called beauty. Yet even as her eyes glistened with tears that threatened to fall, they did not break, did not yield, for there was a fire beneath the wetness, a stubborn refusal to let those who mocked her claim victory over the moment she had once imagined as the crown of her life. She had dreamed of this day since girlhood, when she stitched scraps of muslin into make-believe veils, when she whispered vows to the desert wind in the quiet of her family's porch, when she believed love was enough to shield her from the judgments of a town whose gossip always bit deeper than the spurs on a cowboy's boot. But Dustwater, cruel as drought and sharp as rusted tin, had twisted her dream into a trial by humiliation, a gauntlet of smirks and sneers she had never invited but was forced to walk through as if the cost of love was public degradation. Her dress, once white with promise, no longer carried innocence or purity. It had become a battle standard planted defiantly in hostile ground, every stitch holding not lace and silk but the burden of her dignity, every thread an act of defiance against the vultures who circled for her collapse. She could feel the weight of eyes on her back like arrows aimed at the softest part of her soul, the whispers a chorus meant to break her stride. But she kept her spine straight, even as her knees trembled, because she knew if she faltered, if she let them see her stumble, it would confirm every vile word they had breathed about her. Inside her chest, her heart pounded, not with joy as she had once imagined, but with fury and resolve. The kind born of 1,000 smaller humiliations, comments on her shape, laughter at her expense, the cruel game of being compared and found lacking against other women who fit neatly into Dustwater's narrow mold of worth. She thought of those years, each cutting remark she had swallowed, each smile she had forced, and realized that this moment was not just about her wedding but about every slight endured, every cruelty endured in silence. And now her silence had turned to steel. Each step forward was a proclamation that they could not erase her, could not erase the love that had carried her to this day, could not erase the strength it took to face down a whole town with nothing but a dress and a vow in her pocket. The church loomed ahead, no longer a place of refuge but a proving ground, and she walked toward it not as a meek bride trembling at the altar of expectation but as a woman who bore her scars openly, who planted her banner in their dust and dared them to say she did not belong. Her tears remained unshed, her eyes wet but unbroken, because she understood that if she broke here, if she let Dustwater win, they would remember her not as a woman of love and strength but as a woman undone by cruelty. And so she carried on, her dress dragging in the dust, her breath steadying with every step, her resolve hardening into something that no whisper, no smirk, no sideways glance could ever take from her again. Then a voice, soft but steady, cut through the clamor like a blade through cloth, silencing laughter in mid-breath and halting whispers that had been flowing like a poisoned stream, and all eyes turned to find its source not the bride, trembling but unbroken, nor the groom, still as stone at the church doors, but the merchant's daughter, a slip of a girl younger than most women gathered there, yet standing with a steadiness that belied her years, fire alive in her gaze as though she carried a torch no cruelty could smother. She stepped forward from the press of the crowd, her dress plain compared to the silks and lace around her, her hands clenched not in fear but in conviction, her voice gathering strength with every syllable. "What kind of strength does it take to mock a woman?" she said, each word deliberate, landing with the weight of gunfire in the stilling air. "When it takes far greater to stand in her place." The words rang out across the dirt street, rolling like thunder after a lightning strike, and in their echo the town's cruelty was laid bare, exposed for what it was. Not wit, not truth, but cowardice dressed up in laughter. For a moment, no one breathed, as if the world itself had paused to hear her defiance. The air tight with the realization that a child had spoken what grown men dared not, that honesty had come not from pulpits or elders but from a young woman who saw more clearly than those who claimed to know better. Mothers blinked behind their veils, suddenly uncomfortable, their whispered barbs turned bitter in their throats. Men who had smirked shifted uneasily, finding their boots more interesting than the bride they had mocked. And even the children, who had learned cruelty like a trade, fell silent, sensing the shift in power. The bride's shoulders lifted ever so slightly, as though the words had reached her like a lifeline, pulling her from the quicksand of shame the town had tried to bury her in. The groom's eyes, unreadable until now, flickered with something like pride, though he still held his tongue. And the merchant's daughter did not step back, did not flinch from the weight of the crowd's attention. She stood firm in the dust, her voice still echoing in the air like the tolling of a bell that would not be unheard. For in that instant, the narrative cracked. The cruelty that had seemed so natural, so acceptable, was revealed as hollow, cowardly, small, and the people of Dustwater, for all their pride and posturing, could not unhear what had been spoken. The words did not just defend the bride, they indicted the town itself, calling into question every smirk, every whisper, every cruel laugh, and though many of them shifted in discomfort, no one found the courage to answer her. It was as if her voice had pulled back the curtain and left them naked in their shame. And the silence that followed was not just absence of sound but the birth of something new, the uneasy recognition that the measure of strength was not found in ridicule but in resilience. And though no one knew it yet, those words, spoken by a girl with fire in her gaze, would linger in Dustwater long after the dust had settled, reshaping the way the town would remember this day, not as a wedding of mockery, but as the morning when truth spoke louder than cruelty, and a single voice turned an entire street cold. The laughter died like a gunshot cut short, an abrupt silence that rang louder than the bells had minutes before, leaving the air thick and brittle, as though even sound itself had been shamed into retreat. And in that charged stillness the street seemed frozen, the dust settling mid-air, the children hushed by instincts older than their years, the men stiff in their boots, the women clutching their gloves tighter, as if fabric might shield them from the sting of their own conscience. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, desert heat pressing down heavy, reminding every soul in Dustwater that words once spoken could not be unsaid, and truth once heard could not be unheard. Faces turned, some slowly, others in a guilty snap, eyes darting away from the bride they had mocked, ashamed yet stubborn. For Dustwater was a place where pride was as thick as the dust, and harder to swallow than whiskey gone sour. The crowd did not like to be called out, least of all by a girl with fire in her eyes, and yet they could not deny the weight of her words, not when they hung in the air like the last toll of a bell, resonating in the hollows of their own cruelty. Some shifted uncomfortably, glancing at one another for courage to sneer again, but no one dared laugh. No one dared spit another insult into the dust, because the merchant's daughter had carved into the heart of their ridicule and exposed it for what it was, weakness dressed as strength. And in that silence, in that pause where pride and guilt wrestled in every chest, the bride's tears, which had been born of sorrow, humiliation, and the endless sting of mockery, shifted into something sharper, fiercer, a glimmer of steel behind the wetness. They were no longer tears of defeat but of revelation, the kind that mark a turning point, when pain hardens into defiance, when wounds become scars that no longer bleed but burn with memory. She raised her chin, just a little, the weight of her veil suddenly lighter, the bouquet in her trembling hands steadier, because she realized she was no longer walking alone, no longer standing as the object of ridicule, but as the bearer of a truth spoken aloud for all to hear. She could feel the crowd shrinking from her in small, invisible ways, their shoulders tightening, their eyes refusing to meet hers because they had been forced to see themselves reflected in the cruelty they had inflicted, and that reflection burned worse than the desert Sunday. The street, moments ago a theater of mockery, had turned into a courtroom, and the verdict, though unspoken, was clear. They were the guilty ones. The groom, still silent at the church doors, clenched his jaw tighter, but this time there was no mistaking the glint of pride in his eyes. Pride not just for the bride who refused to break, but for the young voice that had broken the spell of cruelty that Dustwater had wrapped so tightly around her. And in that breathless stillness, as the town wrestled with its shame and the bride found the first stirrings of power in her pain, something irreversible began to take root. A quiet revolution planted in the dust, unseen but unstoppable, carried not by weapons or laws but by the sharp clarity of truth and the resilience of a woman who chose not to crumble. The groom finally spoke, his voice low but unshakable, cutting through the silence like a train whistle echoing across the desert, carrying not only sound but the force of a man who had held his tongue too long and now could not be stopped. And when he said, "She is the strongest soul I've ever known," the words rolled like thunder across the gathered crowd, breaking over their heads and rattling their bones, leaving no one untouched by the weight of their truth. His eyes never left his bride, steady and fierce, as though she were the only one worth seeing. And the town that had measured her in sneers and smirks now found itself judged by the unwavering conviction of the man they had thought to see falter. "Dustwater can measure beauty in whispers," he continued, each word precise, each pause deliberate, "but I'll measure it in the way she stands against them all." The statement was not just a defense, it was an indictment. A mirror shoved into the faces of every man and woman who had traded in cruelty that morning. And the shame it stirred cracked through the crowd's hold like a hammer through glass, splintering the smug unity of their mockery into shards of regret, envy, and discomfort. The men shifted under his words, some glaring at the ground, others clenching their jaws, their pride wounded by the reminder that real strength was not in tearing down but in lifting up. The women, who had dressed themselves in judgment like jewelry, found their lace gloves heavy, their whispers hollow, their carefully sharpened comments suddenly dull and powerless in the face of a love so boldly declared. Even the children, those cruel imitators of adult malice, sensed the shift, their eyes wide as they watched a man carve out a new truth in the middle of the street. The bride, who had braced herself for silence, for abandonment, felt her breath steady as his words wrapped around her like armor, the trembling in her hands easing, the sting of tears replaced with a heat that spread from her chest outward, a warmth born not of rescue but of recognition. Someone had seen her strength. Someone had named it, and in naming it, given it back to her tenfold. The crowd, for all its stubborn pride, could not laugh, could not smirk, because his voice carried the undeniable authority of a man unafraid to stand alone, and in that defiance they saw their own cowardice reflected too clearly to deny. The street seemed to shift, the air thick with a new kind of tension, not the easy cruelty of gossip, but the hard silence of realization, the kind that leaves a mark deeper than any insult. Dustwater had always prided itself on toughness, on grit, on the harsh measures by which it weighed men and women alike. But here was a new measure, spoken plain and strong, and it was not of bone or muscle or shape, but of endurance, of courage, of the unbreakable will of a woman who had stood against them all. The groom's words hung in the air long after his voice fell quiet, as enduring as any oath, as binding as any vow. And though the crowd would not admit it then, they knew something inside Dustwater had cracked open and could not be shut again. For the day's cruelty had been met not with silence, not with shame, but with a truth so sharp and steady it could not be ignored. Shame rippled through the onlookers like a cold wind that cut deeper than the desert sun could ever scorch, creeping into collars and under skin, settling heavy in the bellies of men who had smirked too wide and women who had whispered too long. And in that sudden, fragile silence, the sound of shifting boots and rustling skirts became louder than any laughter that had filled the street before. Hats lowered, their brims pulled down as though cloth could shield a man from the truth of what he had joined in, and eyes turned away, unable to meet the gaze of the bride who stood at the center of their cruelty, unwilling to face the mirror that the groom's words and the merchant's daughter's courage had held up to them all. Some hearts softened, cracks forming where pride had long ruled, their hardness beginning to dissolve under the weight of what they had witnessed, small flickers of regret sparking in souls that had rarely questioned themselves, but others hardened further, doubling down in silence, their lips tight and their spines stiff, unwilling to admit they had been wrong, unwilling to bow before a woman they had mocked, and a man who had dared to defy them. Yet, despite those hardened hearts, no one laughed again, for the laughter had lost its power, stripped of the venom that once fueled it, exposed as nothing more than cowardice dressed in mockery. And in that silence, in that sudden absence of cruelty, the bride stood taller, her back straightening as though invisible chains had been cut loose, and the weight on her chest, heavy as a millstone only moments before, lifted as if carried off by the desert wind itself, leaving her lighter, freer, and stronger than she had ever felt in her life. The bouquet in her hands no longer trembled, and her tears no longer blurred her vision, for she could see clearly now not just the church ahead, but the truth that had risen in the dust that morning, a truth that belonged to her, one that Dustwater could never again bury under whispers and ridicule. She inhaled deeply, filling her lungs not with the dust of shame but with the sharp, clean air of vindication, and as she did, she realized the day no longer belonged to their scorn but to her resilience, to her courage, to the love that stood waiting at the church doors. The crowd, unsettled and uneasy, seemed to shrink before her, their numbers unchanged but their presence diminished, for power had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and though they tried to disguise it with lowered gazes and stiff silence, she could feel it, like the hush after a storm when the land knows it has been changed forever. The desert wind, which had seemed harsh and mocking before, now felt like an ally, brushing against her veil and tugging at her dress as if urging her forward, whispering not of shame but of freedom, and in that whisper she heard the faint promise that Dustwater's judgment was no longer hers to carry. Her chest rose higher, her step steadier, for she understood now that strength was not the absence of fear or pain, but the will to stand and move forward despite it, and with every heartbeat, with every breath, she grew taller in the eyes of those who had tried to make her small, and though no one spoke it aloud, though pride sealed their lips tight, the truth had settled like dust over the town. They had tried to break her, but instead, they had revealed her as unbreakable, and in that revelation, Dustwater itself had been changed. Inside the church, the vows rose not in whispers or trembling tones but with the crackling fire of conviction, each word spoken like a match struck in the dark, steady and bright, lighting the air with a heat that could not be ignored. And though the wooden pews creaked softly as family and a few brave friends leaned forward to hear, it was the bride's voice that filled the space, ringing out clear, her hand strong in his, her eyes unflinching as they locked on the man who had stood silent at the doors until his words shattered the cruelty outside. She had entered expecting to bow her head beneath a storm of judgment, but now she stood with her chin high, each vow she spoke, carrying the weight of every humiliation she had endured and every ounce of strength it had given her, so that when she said, "I will stand by you," it was not just a promise to her groom but a declaration to Dustwater itself that she would never again be measured by whispers. His voice followed, deep and steady, not a shield for her but a companion to her defiance, each syllable bound to hers, weaving a tapestry of unity that even the harshest eyes could not unravel. Outside, the town stood in uneasy quiet, their shame pressing against the windows like a restless wind, listening, learning, unable to turn away from the sound of vows that rang louder than their mockery ever had. The silence was different now, no longer sharp with ridicule, but heavy with reflection, as though the very walls of the church carried the echo of truth into the streets. Children who had mimicked their elders' cruelty clutched at their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, sensing that they were witnessing something they could not yet name but would never forget. Men tugged at their hats, scowling not at the bride or groom but at themselves, their smirks stolen by the realization that they had been complicit in a cruelty so small compared to the strength displayed within those wooden doors. Women lowered their fans, their whispers stilled, their mouths dry, because the bride they had belittled had now claimed the space of strength they themselves had never dared to occupy, and it unsettled them in ways they could not explain. The vows continued, spoken not in haste but with the rhythm of truth, each promise a stone laid in the foundation of a life built not on the fragile ground of appearance but on the bedrock of resilience and love. And as they were spoken, the church seemed to glow not with candlelight, but with the raw, unshakable certainty that something had shifted, that a woman mocked for daring to wear white had instead redefined what it meant to stand before God and community as a bride. When the final words were spoken and sealed with the joining of hands, it was not a timid kiss or trembling smile that followed, but a moment of stillness, a fire in their eyes that declared without speech, "We are unbroken." And outside, Dustwater listened, pressed against the glass, against the wood, against their own pride, and though no one admitted it aloud, every soul there carried away a lesson they had not expected to learn, that true vows are not measured by lace, by shape, by beauty in the shallow sense, but by the courage to speak them with fire in a world that would rather see you fall silent. Dustwater would never forget that day, though for many it began like any other, with the same dust rising off the streets, the same sun climbing slow over the horizon, and the same small-town whispers curling through the air. But by the time the church bells tolled their last, the town had been reshaped in ways no one could have predicted, leaving scars and lessons alike etched into its memory like carvings on stone. In the years that followed, folks did not speak of it as the wedding of shame, though they might have once intended it that way, but as the morning the measure of beauty in Dustwater shifted, the morning when whispers lost their venom and the town's cruel laughter was silenced by something far stronger, the fire of truth and the unshakable courage of those who dared to speak and stand. Parents would hush their children when they asked why the bride had been mocked, ashamed to admit their own part in it. And yet those same parents would retell the story, shaping it into a parable not of cruelty but of transformation, because it was easier to claim they had witnessed the changing of Dustwater's heart than to admit they had once fed its ugliness. And through those tellings, one voice always rang louder than the rest. The merchant's daughter, remembered not as a child but as the girl who had stood against a town with only her words as weapons. Her declaration, "What kind of strength does it take to mock a woman when it takes far greater to stand in her place?" burning itself into the marrow of Dustwater's collective soul, retold in saloons, around campfires, and at kitchen tables long after the dust of that day had settled. They would remember, too, the groom's vow, spoken with a steadiness that shook the pride of every man present, words that had cut through the crowd's cruelty and left them bare, words that turned their whispers to ash. "She is the strongest soul I've ever known. Dustwater can measure beauty in whispers, but I'll measure it in the way she stands against them all." Those words carried further than the church bells ever had, echoing in the silence that followed, and in time they became the line by which other vows were measured, the reminder that beauty was not lace or shape but endurance, dignity, and love that refused to bow. For the bride herself, her life unfolded not in perfection but in strength, her walk that day becoming a story told again and again to children who needed to know that courage could be born in the unlikeliest of places, and though her scars remained, they became badges Dustwater could not deny. The town, stubborn as any western dust-blown settlement, did not change overnight. But the seeds of that morning grew slow and steady, softening tongues that had once been sharp, reminding even the proudest gossips that words could cut but also heal. And so the day was remembered not for the cruelty that had begun it, but for the oath that ended it, an oath louder than bells, stronger than pride, truer than any measure of beauty they had ever known, that beauty lived not in form, not in the fit of a dress or the tilt of a chin, but in the courage to stand unbroken when the world bent itself against you, and that lesson, once learned, could never be silenced.